The earth has a memory. It remembers every footstep, every seed, every whispered promise. But more than that, it holds the deepest secrets, waiting for the right person and the right time to reveal them. Elias Vance never thought those secrets would have anything to do with him, not until a cold Tuesday evening in the sterile dining room of his in-laws, the Ashworths. The air in that room was thin and cold, smelling of polished wood and money, so old it had forgotten its own origins. Silver clinked against porcelain with the sterile sound of a surgeon's tools, and across the vast expanse of the mahogany table, Elias felt the weight of their judgment. He was the farmer, the farm boy as they called him when they thought he couldn't hear, a smudge of honest dirt in their pristine, manicured world. His father-in-law, Richard Ashworth, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, finally set down his wineglass. The sound echoed in the silence. He cleared his throat, a performance of generosity beginning. He spoke of wanting to help, of giving Elias and his daughter, Clara, a real chance at a comfortable life. Then came the offer, wrapped in the silk of false concern. He wanted to buy the Vance family farm, the land that had been in Elias's bloodline for over a century, for a price that was nothing short of an insult. It was, Richard explained, a favor, a way to liquidate a burdensome asset. Elias felt the blood drain from his face, but he didn't look at Richard. He looked at his wife. He looked at Clara, the woman he loved, the woman who had promised to stand with him against the world, and he searched her eyes for an ally. He found nothing. She wouldn't meet his gaze. Instead, he felt the gentle, insistent pressure of her hand on his arm, a silent plea for him to accept, to not make a scene, to simply surrender the last piece of his identity for her family's approval. And in that moment, the clinking of the silverware, the scent of expensive perfume, all of it faded away. There was only the deafening roar of his wife's silence. It was a betrayal colder and sharper than any insult Richard could ever utter. Elias stood up slowly, his chair making a quiet, scraping sound on the marble floor. He nodded, his voice steady when he spoke, a simple thank you for the dinner that tasted like ash in his mouth. As he walked out of that mansion and into the cool night air, he felt a profound and terrifying calm settle over him. The hurt was there, a deep, hollow ache in his chest, but beneath it, something else was taking root. In the quiet car ride home, sitting beside a woman who had suddenly become a stranger, Elias understood. Some seeds are planted not in soil, but in silence and betrayal. And they wait, in the cold and the dark, for the right moment to grow into something no one could ever predict. To understand Elias Vance, you first had to understand his land. The Vance farm wasn't just a plot of earth marked by fences and a deed in the county records office. It was a living history book, its soil dark and rich with the sweat, tears, and hopes of 4 generations. Elias could walk the fields blindfolded and know exactly where he was, just by the feel of the ground beneath his boots. He knew the stubborn clay patch near the southern creek that fought the plow every spring, the soft, loamy stretch in the west field that yielded the sweetest corn, and the silent, shaded grove of ancient oaks where his great-grandmother was buried. This connection wasn't learned from books. It was inherited, breathed in with the dust of summer harvests and the crisp air of autumn mornings. His grandfather, a man with a face like a weathered map and hands as strong as oak roots, had been his true teacher. He hadn't taught Elias how to be a farmer, but how to be a partner to the land. "Anyone can force a seed to grow, boy," his grandfather used to say, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. "But a true farmer listens to what the earth wants to give. You don't own this land, Elias. You're just its current caretaker. Your job is to listen to its stories and pass them on." Elias listened. He learned the language of the wind in the corn stalks, the meaning of a hawk's circling shadow, the promise in the scent of rain on dry soil. He was a quiet man because he was always listening, and in his silence, there was a deep, unshakable strength. It was this quiet strength that had first drawn Clara Ashworth to him. Their meeting felt like a scene from a movie she might have watched, but never imagined starring in. She was on a weekend trip away from the city, an escape her father had called a foolish detour into pastoral nonsense. She'd stopped at a roadside farm stand, frustrated by a flat tire on her imported sports car, looking entirely out of place in her designer clothes. Elias had been the one to help, emerging from the fields with the sun at his back. He didn't fawn over her, didn't seem impressed by her car or her name. He simply saw a problem and fixed it, his movements economical and sure. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were thoughtful and direct. For Clara, who had grown up in a world of flattery, ambition, and veiled intentions, his sincerity was like a drink of cool, clean water. She found excuses to stay longer, fascinated by his world. He showed her how to tell a ripe tomato by its scent, explained the intricate social hierarchy of his chicken coop, and took her to a high ridge to watch the sunset paint the valley in hues of orange and purple. In those moments, surrounded by the simple, profound beauty of his life, Clara felt a sense of peace she had never known. Elias, for his part, was completely captivated. Clara was beautiful, yes, but it was the vulnerability he saw beneath her polished surface that he fell for. He saw a woman trapped in a gilded cage, and he believed his love could be the key to her freedom. He thought their different worlds were a detail, not a barrier. He was wrong. The first time he met her family, the barrier felt like a fortress wall. The Ashworth mansion was less a home and more a museum, cold and imposing, filled with objects that were meant to be admired, not touched. Her father, Richard, had shaken his hand with a grip that was more of an assessment than a greeting, his eyes scanning Elias's worn boots and simple shirt with unconcealed disdain. So, Richard had said, a predatory glint in his eye, "Clara tells me you work with dirt." It wasn't a question, it was a judgment. Her brother, Julian, was even worse. He was a weak man's idea of a strong one, all arrogance and smug superiority. He'd clapped Elias on the back a little too hard and asked if his truck ran on moonshine. Throughout the excruciating dinner, they spoke of stock portfolios, corporate mergers, and upcoming charity galas in Monaco. Topics designed to exclude and belittle him. Elias had remained polite, answering their condescending questions with a quiet dignity that seemed to infuriate them even more. He had looked to Clara for support, and in those early days, she had tried. She would subtly change the subject or flash her father a warning look. Afterwards, in the car, she would apologize profusely. "They're just from a different world, Eli," she would say, her voice laced with an apology he now understood was for him, not for them. "They don't understand, but I do." He had believed her. He had believed that her love was a bridge strong enough to connect their two worlds. He hadn't realized it was only a temporary visa, subject to revocation at any time. Over the years, her defenses of him grew weaker, her apologies more frequent and less sincere. The bridge she was supposed to be building was, in fact, being dismantled, plank by plank, by the relentless pressure of her family. She started to gently suggest he dress differently for their parties, that maybe he shouldn't talk about the farm so much, that he should try to fit in more. Each suggestion was a small cut, a tiny erosion of the man she claimed to love. He was so blinded by his love for her that he interpreted her shame as a desire to protect him. Now, sitting in the darkness of his own living room hours after the disastrous dinner, the memory of his grandfather's words returned to him with chilling clarity. "The land tells you the truth, Elias. It never lies. People, though. People learn to lie to themselves first, and then it becomes easy to lie to everyone else." He finally saw the truth. Clara hadn't just been lying to him. She had been lying to herself for years, pretending she could love a man her family would never respect. The offer to buy his farm wasn't a beginning for them, as Richard had claimed. It was an end. It was the final, desperate attempt to scrub the last bit of farm boy off their pristine family portrait. Elias walked to the window and looked out at the dark, sleeping fields. The land his grandfather had entrusted to him. The land they saw as a worthless speck of dirt. They saw a simple farmer, an obstacle to be removed. They had no idea who he really was. They had no idea what he was capable of. And as the moon cast its pale light over the silent earth, Elias Vance made a silent promise to the memory of his grandfather and to the land itself. They wanted his farm. They would soon learn that he was coming for their entire empire. To call Clara Ashworth Vance a villain would be too simple, for villains often possess a clarity of purpose that she could only dream of. Clara lived in a state of perpetual, elegant confusion, a prisoner in a cage she herself had helped to build and gild. Her life had been a masterclass in transactional affection. From her earliest memories, love and approval from her father were not given freely, but earned through achievement. A perfect report card was met not with a hug, but with a cool nod and the question, "Who placed first?" A victory in an equestrian competition earned a rare smile, a tangible reward. Failure, or even mediocrity, was met with a silence more punishing than any tirade. She learned early on that the Ashworth name was not just a title, but a currency, and her primary duty was to increase its value. Her father, Richard, was the architect of this philosophy. He viewed the world as a grand chessboard, and people, including his own children, were pieces to be moved for strategic advantage. He didn't raise a daughter, he groomed an asset. He taught her which families were worth knowing, which charities were worth supporting for the networking opportunities, and which emotions were liabilities. Grief was unseemly, passion was reckless, and contentment was the enemy of ambition. Her brother, Julian, was Richard's perfect disciple. Where Clara felt the chafe of their father's expectations, Julian wore them like a tailored suit. He embraced the cold calculus of their world, thriving on the power and privilege it afforded him. He saw Elias not just as an unsuitable match for his sister, but as a walking, breathing insult to everything the Ashworths stood for. Julian was the enforcer of the family creed, his mockery and disdain for Elias, a constant, corrosive drip that wore away at the foundations of Clara's marriage. He would send her articles about struggling farmers, with a simple text attached. "Thought you'd find this interesting." He would accidentally call Elias by the wrong name at family functions, a small, deliberate cut designed to remind everyone of his insignificance. For Julian, Elias's very existence was a threat to the pristine, predictable order of his world. When Clara first brought Elias home, it was an act of rebellion, the only one of her life. She had seen in him an escape, a doorway into a world where value was measured in rainfall and harvest, not stock prices and social connections. His love felt real, untainted. With him, on his farm, she felt she could breathe for the first time. She wasn't an Ashworth asset. She was just Clara. She loved the feel of his calloused hand in hers, a tangible link to a life of genuine substance. She convinced herself this love was enough, that she was strong enough to exist in his world. But Richard Ashworth had spent a lifetime ensuring his daughter was never strong enough to leave his orbit. He never forbade her from marrying Elias. That would have been too crude, too obvious. Instead, he played a longer, more insidious game. He expressed his concerns, framing them as fatherly love. "I just want you to be secure, sweetheart," he'd say, his voice a balm of reason. "This life, it's a romantic notion, but it's not practical. You deserve more than a life of struggle." He would praise her intelligence, her grace, her potential, all while subtly implying that being with Elias was wasting it all. He slowly, methodically, reactivated the insecurities he had so carefully installed in her since childhood. The fear of not being enough, the terror of disappointing him, the deep, primal need for his approval. The evening of the disastrous dinner was the culmination of this campaign. In the hours that followed, as Elias slept a heavy, troubled sleep beside her, Clara lay awake. The silence of their bedroom, a roaring tribunal in her mind. She thought of Elias's face when she had failed to defend him, the quiet hurt in his eyes that was so much worse than anger. It felt like a physical wound in her chest. A part of her wanted to shake him awake, to apologize, to pack a bag and run away with him to the farm and never look back. But the gilded bars of her cage were too strong. She could already hear her father's voice, calm and disappointed. She could picture the smug, triumphant look on Julian's face. She imagined the whispers of her social circle, the pitying looks, the quiet ostracization. She thought of her credit cards being declined, of losing the effortless comfort and security that had always been her reality. The farm, which had once seemed like a sanctuary, now felt like a desolate, terrifying wilderness. Her love for Elias was a real and desperate thing, but her fear was an addiction. It was a poison she had been fed her entire life, and she didn't know how to live without it. So, in the pale, pre-dawn light, she made a choice that felt less like a decision and more like an inevitability. She began to lie to herself. She told herself that her father was right. Selling the farm wasn't a betrayal, it was a solution. It would free Elias from his burden, elevate them both, and finally merge their two worlds. It would finally make her father happy, which, she reasoned, would make everyone happy. It was a beautiful, comforting lie. With that lie firmly in place, she finally drifted off to sleep, the conflict in her soul momentarily silenced. She didn't know it yet, but she had just signed the death warrant for her own heart, trading a love that was real for an approval that would never be enough. The weeks following the dinner were a masterclass in silent warfare. Elias and Clara moved through their days in a carefully choreographed dance of avoidance, speaking of trivialities like the weather and groceries, the colossal, unspoken truth of his family's land lying between them like a mountain range. Elias gave her every opportunity to cross it, to come to him, and speak honestly, but she never did. Instead, she became excessively cheerful, her smiles too bright, her laughter too loud, her every gesture a frantic attempt to paper over the gaping cracks in their foundation. He watched her, and for the first time, he saw not the woman he loved, but a performer, and a rather desperate one at that. The final, irreparable fracture occurred not at their quiet home, but back in the Lion's Den, the Ashworth estate, during their annual summer charity gala. It was a sprawling affair, a sea of glittering jewels and false smiles on a perfectly manicured lawn. Elias, in a suit that felt like a costume, was a solitary island in that sea. Julian, emboldened by his father's open campaign against Elias, had escalated his torment from veiled insults to overt humiliation. He cornered Elias near the bar, a group of his sycophantic friends in tow. "Elias, my good man," Julian boomed, sloshing his champagne. "I was just telling our friends here about your profession. It's so wonderfully elemental." He gestured vaguely towards the garden. "You must feel right at home amongst all this dirt." His friends chuckled, the sound like breaking glass. Elias remained impassive, his jaw tight. "It's honest work, Julian," he said, his voice low and even. Julian's eyes narrowed, angered by Elias's refusal to be baited. He then noticed a small, framed photograph that Elias had set on a nearby table. It was a faded black and white picture of his grandparents on their wedding day, standing proudly in front of the old farmhouse. Elias had brought it to show a distant relative of the Ashworths who had expressed an interest in local history. Before Elias could react, Julian picked it up. "Ah, the founding fathers of the Vance dynasty," he sneered, "quite the legacy." And then, with a theatrical stumble that fooled no one, he let the frame slip from his fingers. It hit the stone patio with a sickening crack, the glass shattering across the image of his grandparents' smiling faces. "Oh, clumsy me," Julian said, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "It seems some things just aren't meant to last." Something inside Elias went cold and still. The polite facade, the pretense he had been maintaining for weeks, crumbled to dust. He didn't say a word. He simply knelt, carefully picked up the broken frame, and walked away. The sound of Julian's mocking laughter following him like a disease. He needed to escape, to breathe air that wasn't thick with their contempt. He walked back into the sprawling mansion, seeking refuge in the one place he knew would be empty, the library. He closed the heavy oak doors behind him, the silence a blessed relief. But as he stood there, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to salvage the torn photograph, he heard voices from the adjoining study. The door was ajar, just a crack. It was Clara's voice, and her tone made the hair on his arms stand up. It was not the soft, gentle voice he knew. This was the Ashworth voice, sharp, impatient, clinical. "I am handling it, Dad," she was saying, the words clipped and frustrated. "You have to give me time. He's being incredibly stubborn about it, acting as if he's the king of some pathetic patch of dirt." A pause. Elias felt his own breath catch in his throat. A patch of dirt. That was his home, his legacy. I know the timeline is critical, Clara continued, her voice dropping slightly. I know the prospectus for the new federal highway is being finalized. I understand that we have to acquire the title before the route is made public, or the price will skyrocket. There it was, the final, ugly truth, laid bare in the hushed tones of a conspiracy. It wasn't about helping them. It was never about their future. It was a calculated scheme, a land grab based on insider information, and his own wife was the chief architect of his deception. He heard her sigh, a sound of pure exasperation. He's a simple man, Dad. Sentimental. I just have to find the right leverage. Don't worry, I'll break him down. He'll sign. Elias didn't hear Richard's reply. He didn't need to. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the muffled sounds of the party outside fading into a dull, distant roar. He looked down at the shattered picture in his hands, at the smiling faces of the two people who had taught him the meaning of integrity and love. He felt a profound, bottomless grief, not for the broken glass, but for the shattered illusion of his marriage. The woman in the next room was not his Clara. His Clara had gotten lost somewhere along the way, or perhaps she had never existed at all. This woman was a stranger, an Ashworth, who looked at him and saw not a husband, but an obstacle, a simple man to be broken. A quiet rage, cold and pure and absolute, began to flow into the spaces where his love for her had been. He did not storm into the study. He did not confront her. That was what the simple man she believed him to be would have done. Instead, he carefully placed the broken frame into his jacket pocket, smoothed his tie, and walked out of the library. He re-entered the glittering party, his face a calm, unreadable mask. A few minutes later, Clara emerged from the house, her face flushed with a triumphant energy. She saw him and her bright, false smile snapped into place. "Oh, Eli, there you are. I was looking for you." He met her gaze, and for the first time he smiled back with the same calculated emptiness. "I'm right here," he said. And in that moment, she had no idea how true that statement was. He was there, he was watching, and the war she thought she was winning had just truly begun. The drive home from the gala was utterly silent. It was a silence Clara mistook for surrender. She saw the slump of her husband's shoulders, the way he stared blankly at the road ahead, and she interpreted it as the quiet grief of a man finally accepting his own defeat. She felt a pang of something that might have been guilt, but she quickly smothered it with the comforting thought that this was for the best. She believed his spirit had been broken by Julian's cruelty and the relentless pressure from her family. She thought he was finally ready to yield. In truth, the man sitting beside her had never been more alive or more dangerous. The grief was real, but it was the grief one feels at a graveside, a final farewell to a love that was now dead and buried. What had replaced it was a state of crystalline, hyper-focused clarity. The battle was over, but the war was just beginning. Elias Vance was no longer a husband trying to save his marriage. He was a general surveying a battlefield, and his wife was now officially on the other side. In the days that followed, Elias began the performance of his life. He became the man they all expected him to be. A simple farmer, emotionally crushed and out of his depth. When Clara would bring up the sale of the land, her voice soft with feigned sympathy, he no longer argued. He would just run a hand through his hair, sigh a weary sigh, and murmur things like, "I just need to think, Clara," or "There's so much to consider." He let his shoulders sag. He stopped tending to his prized rose garden. He made sure she saw him sitting on the porch for long periods, staring out at the fields with a vacant expression. Every action was a carefully placed piece of camouflage, designed to lull the enemy into a state of supreme overconfidence. The effect was immediate. Clara reported back to her father that Elias was coming around, that his will was eroding. Julian called once, offering a smug, insincere apology for the broken photograph. Elias accepted it with a tired, hollow voice that made Julian puff up with pride. The Ashworths saw exactly what they wanted to see, a man collapsing under the weight of their power. They had no idea that while the scarecrow stood listless in the field by day, the farmer was sharpening his scythe by night. His grandfather's old study, A room that had smelled of pipe tobacco and old books for 50 years became his war room. After Clara was asleep, Elias would slip into the small wood-paneled room and a different man would emerge. The weary, defeated husband vanished, replaced by a strategist of singular, obsessive focus. The first night, he carefully glued the shards of glass back onto his grandparents' photograph, the meticulous work calming his mind. He placed the repaired frame on the corner of the desk, a silent monument to what he was fighting for. Then, he turned on the old desktop computer and began to dig. He started with the phrase he'd overheard. Federal Highway Prospectus. Hours of research led him through the labyrinthine websites of state and federal transportation departments. He learned about planning corridors, environmental impact studies, and the long, bureaucratic process of eminent domain. He found murmurs and proposals for a new interstate connector in his region, but the exact route was still a matter of classified speculation. The Ashworths didn't just have a good guess. They had a certainty, and that meant they had a source. This wasn't just sharp business, it was corruption. Next, he turned his attention to Ashworth Industries. Publicly, it was a titan of real estate and development, a pillar of the financial community. But Elias had learned from his grandfather that even the biggest oak can be rotten on the inside. He spent nights poring over their quarterly earnings reports, their shareholder statements, their press releases. He didn't have a business degree, but he had a farmer's patience and an eye for patterns. He noticed a trend. The company was taking on an enormous amount of debt. They were borrowing heavily, leveraging their existing assets to the hilt to fund a series of massive, ambitious new projects. It was the strategy of a gambler betting everything on a single, sure thing. That sure thing, he realized with a cold certainty, was his land and the immense profit the new highway would bring. They weren't just trying to cheat him, their entire corporate future was dependent on it. He realized then that he couldn't do this alone. He needed professional help. He used a substantial portion of his life savings, money he had set aside for a new tractor, and drove to a neighboring state. He met a man named Frank in the back booth of a dimly lit diner. Frank was a private investigator, a former financial journalist with a cynical view of the world and a reputation for being discreet and thorough. Elias, dressed in simple jeans and a flannel shirt, laid out his request calmly and precisely. He didn't speak of betrayal or family drama. He simply said he was a landowner considering a business deal with Ashworth Industries and wanted a complete confidential workup of their financial health, their debt structure, and any potential liabilities. Frank raised a skeptical eyebrow, surprised by the farm boy's request, but as he listened to Elias's sharp, specific questions, his skepticism turned to respect. This was not a simple man. A week later, a plain manila envelope arrived at a post office box Elias had set up in another town. Inside was Frank's preliminary report. Elias sat in his truck and read it as the sun set, the pages glowing in the dim light. The report confirmed his suspicions, and then some. Ashworth Industries was leveraged to a staggering 90%. Their primary lenders were getting nervous. They had missed a recent covenant on a major loan, and a 30-day grace period was ticking away. They were a house of cards, beautiful on the outside, but one stiff breeze away from total collapse. Reading those pages, Elias felt no joy, no thrill of impending victory. He felt a profound and solemn weight. He was holding the blueprint to his enemy's destruction. He drove back to his farm and walked out to the highest point of the ridge, the same spot where he had watched the sunset with Clara in those early, hopeful days. He looked down at the rolling hills and shadowed valleys of his home. The land was quiet, patient, holding its secrets. In that moment, he made a silent vow. It was not a vow of revenge, not simply to take from them what they had tried to take from him. It was a vow of justice. He would be the stiff breeze. He would let the truth of their own greed and corruption be the force that brought their hollow empire crashing down. He would not just protect his legacy, he would honor it by exposing their lies. The simple farmer was gone. The architect of their downfall was ready to begin his work. That summer, the earth grew thirsty. A relentless, unforgiving sun beat down on the Vance farm, baking the soil into a cracked and barren crust. The creek that bordered the south pasture dwindled to a muddy trickle, and the corn stalks, which should have been high and green, were stunted and yellowed. The old well, the one his grandfather had sworn would never run dry, began to sputter, drawing up more air than water. For the first time in his life, Elias felt the land groaning in pain, and he knew he had to do something. The Ashworths saw his struggle and rejoiced. Clara would call, her voice dripping with manufactured concern, and ask if he needed anything, if perhaps now was the time to finally let go of this burden. Each call was a fresh twist of the knife, strengthening his resolve. They thought the drought was their greatest ally, a force of nature that would finally break his spirit and deliver his farm into their hands. They had no idea it was about to become the instrument of their own destruction. Elias decided to deepen the old well, a task his grandfather had always spoken of but never undertaken. He rented a modern, powerful drill rig, a piece of machinery that felt alien and brutal on his ancestral land. For 2 days, he worked under the oppressive sun, the engine's roar a constant assault on the farm's tranquility. He drilled past the point his father had reached, past the bedrock his grandfather had hit, down into the deep, ancient layers of the earth. On the 3rd day, late in the afternoon, something changed. The steady, grinding rhythm of the drill bit biting through rock faltered. The sound deepened into a thick, guttural chewing, and the whole rig shuddered. Elias cut the engine, the sudden silence ringing in his ears. He slowly began to retract the drill string, his farmer's intuition telling him he hadn't hit water. The air grew heavy with a strange, acrid smell, a scent like tar and lightning, something ancient and deeply mineral. It was a smell that didn't belong in his world of hay and loam. When the drill bit finally emerged from the borehole, it was not coated in mud or clay. It was slick with a viscous, iridescent black liquid that clung to the metal like a living skin. It was thick, greasy, and blacker than a starless night. Elias stared at it, his heart hammering in his chest. He was not a geologist, but he was a man of the earth, and he knew this substance was not of the surface world. And then, a memory, dormant for 30 years, surfaced in his mind with the force of a revelation. He was a small boy again, sitting on the front porch with his grandfather, watching a summer storm roll in. His grandfather had been staring out at the fields, his expression distant and solemn. "This land gives us everything we need to live, Elias," the old man had said, his voice barely a whisper above the rising wind. "It gives us water for our thirst and soil for our seeds. But deep down, in its bones, it holds the blood of the old world, a different kind of power, a dangerous kind. You don't ever go looking for it. It only reveals itself when the time is right, when a great justice is needed, the blood of the old world." Elias looked from the black liquid back toward the old farmhouse, a chill running down his spine despite the blistering heat. A great justice is needed. From that moment on, he moved with the clandestine precision of a spy. His daytime performance as the defeated husband continued, providing the perfect cover. By night, he returned to the well. He sealed the borehole, covering his work meticulously. He siphoned a sample of the black liquid into a large, sterilized glass mason jar, wiping every surface clean of any residue. He buried the tools he had used. No one could ever know. The next day, he told Clara he was driving to a livestock auction 2 states over, a plausible errand for a struggling farmer. The auction was a lie. His real journey was to a commercial geological laboratory in a sprawling, anonymous industrial park hundreds of miles away. He had found it after hours of research, a lab that valued corporate discretion and cash payments. He walked in, gave the name Mr. Jones, and placed the mason jar on the counter. He asked for a full compositional analysis and a reserve estimate based on core saturation. He paid in cash, left a burner phone number, and walked away without a backward glance. The week he waited for the results was the longest of his life. He went about his chores on the farm, his body on autopilot, while his mind existed in a state of suspended animation. He was standing on the precipice of a new reality, and he didn't know if the fall would kill him or teach him how to fly. The call came on a Friday afternoon while he was mending a fence line. The burner phone buzzed in his pocket, a sound both terrifying and exhilarating. It was the lead geologist from the lab. "Mr. Jones?" The man's voice was strained, trying and failing to sound nonchalant. "About that sample you provided. It's remarkable, extraordinarily high grade, low sulfur crude. But that's not the main thing." The geologist paused, taking a deep breath. "Sir, my team ran a preliminary seismic scan based on the sample's geological markers. I have to tell you, this is highly irregular, but the potential energy signature we're reading is astronomical. Are you certain of the sample's origin point?" Elias, leaning against a fence post, his knuckles white, simply said, "I am." There was another pause. "Well, Mr. Jones," the geologist finally said, his voice full of awe, "whatever you're sitting on out there, it's not a pocket, it's a sea." The full report arrived later that day in a password-protected email, which Elias opened on a public computer at the town library. He printed the 30-page document and took it back to his truck, the sanctuary where he did his real thinking. He read it not once, but 3 times. He looked at the charts, the graphs, the dizzying strings of numbers that represented barrel estimates and potential market value. The numbers were so large they seemed fictional, meaningless. They spoke of a fortune that could buy and sell the Ashworths 100 times over, but Elias didn't feel the euphoric rush of a lottery winner. He felt the cold, heavy weight of destiny. This was not luck. This was the answer to his silent vow. This was the land itself, rising up to defend its own. His grandfather had been right. The earth had revealed its most dangerous secret, its ancient power. The blood of the old world was now in his hands, and he knew exactly what he was going to do with it. He was going to use it to bring a great and terrible justice. The geological report lay on the passenger seat of his truck, its 30 pages feeling heavier than a mountain. In that moment, Elias Vance stood at a crossroads that few men ever face. One path was simple, bathed in sunlight. He could make a single phone call to one of the global energy giants. Within weeks, his name would be a footnote in their corporate history, but his bank account would hold a sum of money so vast it would be generational, a fortune that would allow him to disappear and live a life of unimaginable ease. He could walk away from the Ashworths, from the betrayal, from the pain. He could let them have their hollow victory with the highway, content in the knowledge that his own wealth dwarfed their wildest ambitions. It was the logical choice. It was the sane choice. But as he looked out the windshield at the farmhouse his great-grandfather had built with his own 2 hands, he knew it was a choice he could not make. Wealth was not the goal. Survival was not the goal. The goal was justice. The land had not whispered its secret to him so he could run away. It had armed him for the war he was already in. He folded the report, his decision made. He would not sell his power to another king. He would become a king himself. His first move was to contact Frank, the private investigator. The conversation was brief and to the point. Elias didn't need more information on Ashworth Industries' weaknesses. He needed a weapon of a different sort. "Frank," he said over his burner phone, "I need a name. I'm looking for the best corporate lawyer in the country. Not the most famous, not the most expensive, the most ruthless. The one they call when all the rules have been broken and they need someone to write new ones." Frank was silent for a long moment, then gave a low whistle. "You're not playing in the shallow end anymore, are you, kid?" He gave Elias a single name, Evelyn Reed. She was a legend in the steel and glass canyons of Chicago, a legal shark who swam in the blood-red waters of hostile takeovers and corporate raiding. Getting a meeting with her was said to be harder than getting a confession from a stone. Elias sent her a 1-line email from an encrypted account. "I have a certified geological survey that will change the energy map of North America, and I need to build a ghost." 2 hours later, he had his meeting. He met Evelyn Reed in her corner office, overlooking Lake Michigan, a sterile, minimalist space that felt more like an operating theater than a law office. She was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She assessed his simple attire, his calloused hands, and his calm demeanor with a flicker of curiosity. She had expected a swaggering oil prospector, not this quiet, intense man who looked like he had just walked out of a field. He didn't speak of his family, his wife, or his betrayal. He simply laid the geological report on her desk and told her his objective. He wanted to create a corporate entity, an untraceable holding company, with the sole purpose of acquiring a controlling interest in another publicly traded company. He wanted to do it silently, quickly, and decisively. As she read the report, her professional mask of cool detachment slowly dissolved, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. The numbers were staggering. She looked up from the pages, her sharp eyes reassessing the man before her. "Mr. Jones," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "With this, you could buy a small country. Ashworth Industries. That's like using a cannon to hunt a rabbit." Elias met her gaze without flinching. "The rabbit broke into my home and tried to steal my heritage," he said softly. "It deserves the cannon." In that moment, Evelyn Reed smiled, a thin, predatory smile. She was in. Under her expert guidance, the ghost was born. Terra Vance Holdings was incorporated in Delaware, shielded by a labyrinthine structure of subsidiary LLCs and offshore trusts that made its true ownership impossible to trace. The name was Elias's only personal touch, a silent declaration of his purpose. Terra for the earth he was defending, Vance for the legacy he was avenging. Evelyn secured a confidential, multi-billion-dollar line of credit for the holding company from a private Swiss bank, using the certified mineral rights as collateral. The first drops of the Earth's blood were beginning to flow, not into a pipeline, but into a war chest. While Evelyn built the legal fortress, Elias began his own transformation. He was no longer just the client, he was the general, and he needed to understand the terrain of this new war. His grandfather's study became a university. He devoured books on subjects he'd never heard of: securities trading, leveraged buyouts, shareholder activism. He studied the lives of the great corporate raiders of the past, learning their strategies, their ruthlessness, their patience. He filled yellow legal pads with notes, his neat, practical handwriting mapping out stock accumulation strategies and debt acquisition timelines. He learned the language of Wall Street, the predatory dialect of his enemies. The farmer who knew the perfect time to plant a seed now learned the perfect time to execute a stock trade. His dual life became a precarious balancing act. One morning, Clara walked into the kitchen to find him at the table, surrounded by papers filled with complex charts and figures. "What on earth is all that?" she asked, a hint of her old Ashworth condescension in her voice. Without missing a beat, Elias slid a colorful seed catalog over the documents. "Just planning for next season," he said, looking up at her with his practiced, weary eyes. "Trying to figure out if I can afford to plant at all." She had looked at him with a mixture of pity and relief, convinced he was poring over crop yields, a simple farmer wrestling with his simple problems. She had no idea he was studying the precise financial weaknesses of her father's company, planning a harvest of a very different kind. Finally, the day came when the preparations were complete. Elias sat in his study, the door locked, participating in a secure video conference with Evelyn Reed and a hand-picked team of financial analysts she had assembled. On the screen was the complete, dissected anatomy of Ashworth Industries. They were no longer looking at a powerful corporation, they were looking at a patient on an operating table, its vulnerabilities exposed. They had a timeline, a budget, and a clear multi-phase plan of attack. Evelyn looked at Elias's image on her screen, a calm silhouette in a dimly lit room. "The board is set, Elias," she said, foregoing his pseudonym for the first time. "All you have to do is give the order to make the first move." Elias looked at the framed, repaired photograph of his grandparents on his desk. He thought of their legacy, of his grandfather's words, of the great justice that was needed. "Begin," he said. The scent of victory, Richard Ashworth believed, smelled like expensive scotch and Cuban cigar smoke. He swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass, the city lights of Chicago twinkling below his penthouse office like a carpet of fallen stars. On the other end of the phone, his son Julian was practically giddy. "He's broken, Dad," Julian said, his voice brimming with smug satisfaction. "Clara says he just mopes around all day. He's finished. He'll be begging us to take that dirt patch off his hands within the month." Richard took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch. "Patience, Julian," he cautioned, though his own heart swelled with the same arrogant triumph. Let him marinate in his own misery. We want him to be grateful when we take it. The optics are better that way. They both chuckled, two predators celebrating a hunt that was, in their minds, already over. They were so focused on the wounded animal in the field, they never saw the silent, circling shadow of the hawk high above. That shadow had a name: Terra Vance Holdings. While the Ashworths were celebrating, Elias's war machine, commanded by Evelyn Reed, made its first move. It was not a loud frontal assault, but a quiet, insidious infiltration. Evelyn's team didn't start buying stock. They started buying debt. Ashworth Industries, in its arrogant expansion, had spread its financial obligations across half a dozen major banks and investment funds. These institutions were beginning to feel nervous. Richard Ashworth was a master of projecting confidence, but the numbers on their risk assessment reports told a different story. The company was dangerously over-leveraged. So when discreet, seemingly unrelated investment firms began making offers to buy up those debt portfolios, the banks were more than willing to listen. One fund, registered in the Cayman Islands, bought the loan for their failed resort project in Scottsdale. Another, operating out of Zurich, acquired the bond issue for their Chicago office tower. The bank saw it as a routine offloading of a volatile asset to vulture funds looking for a high-risk, high-reward gamble. They had no idea they were selling all their weapons to a single, invisible enemy. Within 3 weeks, without a single headline being written or a single share of stock being publicly traded, Elias Vance, through his ghost corporation, had become Richard Ashworth's primary creditor. He was now the man to whom the king owed almost everything. Only then did the second phase begin. Like 1,000 tiny streams flowing into a single river, Terra Vance began to accumulate stock. The buying was a masterpiece of stealth, orchestrated by a team of elite traders who were masters of the market's dark arts. They used dozens of different brokers, routing trades through complex algorithms that broke large orders into thousands of tiny, insignificant ones. They bought during periods of low volume, at the opening bell, and in the dying seconds before the market closed. The purchases were so small and so scattered that they never triggered the 5% ownership threshold that would require public disclosure. Richard Ashworth, checking the stock ticker, would occasionally notice a small, healthy uptick in his company's value. He interpreted it as the market's confidence in his vision, a sign of his own genius. The irony was exquisite. He was watching his own hanging, admiring the quality of the rope. Fueled by this false confidence and the belief that Elias's land was as good as his, Richard decided to make his masterstroke. To silence the last of his nervous investors, he announced the company's most ambitious project to date, the Ashworth Beacon, a towering, ultra-luxury skyscraper that would dominate the city skyline. It was an act of supreme hubris, a monument to his own ego. To fund it, he took out one last, colossal loan, securing it against the company's few remaining unleveraged assets. It was a bet the company move, a final push of all his chips to the center of the table. He was absolutely certain he held the winning hand. Elias and his team, watching from the shadows, could hardly believe their luck. Richard wasn't just walking into their trap, he was dancing into it. Now it was time for the bait. Elias had to play his part one last time. He called Clara. He made his voice sound hollow, exhausted, the voice of a man utterly defeated. "I can't do this anymore, Clara," he said, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. "The drought, everything. I'm tired of fighting." He let out a long, shaky breath. "Tell your father. Tell him I'm ready to talk. I'm ready to discuss the terms of the sale." On the other end of the line, he heard Clara's sharp intake of breath, a sound of undisguised relief and victory. "Oh, Eli," she said, her voice a perfect imitation of wifely concern. "I think you're making the right decision. The wisest decision." After he hung up, Elias sat in his study for a long time, the silence of the room a stark contrast to the storm of emotions inside him. He had just lied to his wife, using her own treachery as a weapon against her. There was no satisfaction in it, only the grim necessity of a soldier on a battlefield. The news spread through the Ashworth empire like wildfire. Richard was ecstatic. His gamble had paid off. His enemy had surrendered. That very afternoon, he called an emergency meeting with his CFO. Convinced that the influx of cash from the highway deal was now just weeks away, he authorized another round of aggressive spending, leveraging the company even further to fast-track the initial phase of the Beacon project. He felt invincible, untouchable. He was a king surveying his domain, completely unaware that the castle itself was now owned by another. That evening, Elias sat in his study, watching a single updated line of data scroll across his encrypted monitor. A new, massive debt from a consortium of lenders had just been registered against Ashworth Industries. An hour later, his team confirmed it. Through a series of back-channel acquisitions, Terravance now owned 95% of that new debt as well. The last of the enemy's resources had been committed. Every ship was at sea. Every escape route was cut off. A farmer knows that to catch a truly dangerous predator, you must offer it an irresistible bait. And for a man like Richard Ashworth, the most irresistible bait in the world was the sweet, intoxicating illusion of his own absolute victory. The trap was set. All that was left was to spring it. The contract arrived via a high-priced courier, its pages thick with the smug, condescending generosity of the Ashworths. They had offered Elias a sum that was, to them, a pittance, but to a simple farmer, they assumed, a king's ransom. It was a take-it-or-leave-it offer, a final act of dominance. Richard and Julian waited by the phone, expecting an immediate, grateful acceptance. They imagined Elias weeping with joy, his simple mind overwhelmed by the sheer number of zeros. What they got instead was something far more infuriating: silence, followed by a series of trivial, maddening questions relayed through a sleepy, small-town lawyer. Mr. Vance, the lawyer explained in a slow drawl, had concerns. He wanted to ensure the preservation of a stand of birch trees his grandmother had planted. He wanted written assurance that the new owners would care for the family cemetery plot on the North Hill. He wanted, most absurdly of all, the right to come back once a year to harvest apples from a single, ancient tree his grandfather had favored. To Richard Ashworth, a man who thought in terms of billion-dollar deals and concrete skylines, these requests were the nonsensical ramblings of a sentimental fool. "The man is arguing about apples while I'm offering him a fortune," he roared at Julian. "Fine, give him his damned apples. Give him the whole orchard. Just get his signature on that paper." Richard's frustration was a source of great amusement to Elias. He was playing Richard like a fiddle, using the very caricature of the simple farm boy that they had created for him as his most effective weapon. Each petty delay, each sentimental request, served two purposes. It reinforced their belief in his weakness, and it bought his team precious time. While Richard was busy redrafting contracts to include clauses about apple-picking rights, the first shockwave hit. It didn't arrive with a roar, but with the quiet, devastating finality of a legal document. A courier, unimpressed by the opulence of the Ashworth Industries headquarters, delivered a single, crisp envelope to Richard's personal secretary. Inside was not a proposal or a greeting, but a notice of default on a $200 million loan, citing a covenant breach his own accountants had overlooked during their frantic borrowing spree. The letter stated that the current creditor, a firm named Alethea Capital Partners, demanded immediate and full repayment within 72 hours. Richard had never heard of Alethea Capital Partners. He bellowed for his CFO, who was equally mystified. They scrambled, trying to trace the debt's origin, only to find it had been sold and resold through a chain of anonymous funds. They tried to contact Alethea Capital Partners, but their calls were routed to a stone-faced law firm that stated simply, "Our client does not wish to negotiate. The terms are repayment in full." Panic began to curdle Richard's arrogance into a cold, greasy fear. This was not how the world was supposed to work. People negotiated with Richard Ashworth. They begged for his time, for his favor. They did not issue ultimatums. For the first time, he felt a loss of control, a terrifying sense that he was fighting an enemy he couldn't see. The 72 hours passed, the payment was not made, and the squeeze began in earnest. The news, leaked with surgical precision by Elias's team, hit the financial press like a thunderclap. Ashworth Industries in default, faces major liquidity crisis. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The company's stock, once a symbol of stability and power, began to hemorrhage value. The ticker symbol was a waterfall of crimson, the share price plummeting in a terrifying freefall. Investors who had once toasted Richard's genius were now stampeding for the exits, desperate to sell before their holdings turned to dust. The Ashworth offices devolved into a state of controlled chaos. Julian was a nervous wreck, pacing and shouting into his phone, while Richard locked himself in the boardroom, his face ashen, the illusion of his invincibility shattered. He was trapped. To pay the loan, he needed cash. The only way to get cash was to sell assets, but the news of their crisis had devalued everything they owned. There was only one move left, a desperate, suicidal act of self-preservation. He called an emergency meeting of the board. His voice hoarse, he laid out his plan. They would issue a massive block of new treasury shares. It was a high-risk gamble. Flooding the market with new stock would dilute the value of all existing shares, including his own family's controlling stake, but it would generate the immediate infusion of cash they needed to satisfy the mysterious creditor and stabilize the company. A few of the older, wiser board members protested, warning him that they were making themselves vulnerable to a hostile takeover. Who would be foolish enough to try and take over a company in this state? Richard shot back, his voice cracking with desperation and rage. His ego could not, would not, accept the possibility that this was a coordinated attack. He saw it as a stroke of bad luck, a temporary storm he could weather through sheer force of will. He forced the vote, and his motion passed. In his study, Elias watched the events unfold on a series of encrypted screens. He saw the press release announcing the stock offering. He saw the stock price dip even lower, in anticipation of the dilution. The enemy was wounded, desperate, and acting exactly as their psychological profiles had predicted. Evelyn Reed's face appeared on his main monitor, her expression as calm as a frozen lake. "They've taken the final bait, Elias," she said. "They're trying to save their ship by throwing their most valuable cargo overboard." On the trading floor of the firm Terra Vance was using, a team of traders sat poised, their fingers hovering over their keyboards. The offering went live. Millions of shares of Ashworth Industries, the very foundation of the family's power and pride, became available at a humiliatingly low price. Richard Ashworth stared at his own monitor, praying for buyers, for a sign that the world still believed in him. He didn't have to wait long. Less than 5 seconds after the offering opened, a single colossal buy order appeared on the system. It was so large, so instantaneous, that it momentarily froze the trading software. It absorbed not only the entire new offering, but also swept up millions of additional shares from the panic sellers on the open market. In the space of a single heartbeat, it was over. In the Ashworth boardroom, they stared at the screen in stunned confusion, wondering which white knight had just saved them. In his study, Elias watched the confirmation flash on his screen. A single line of text: "Purchase complete. Ownership stake, 50. 1.4%. Evelyn Reed allowed herself a thin, satisfied smile. "The company is yours, Mr. Vance," she said. Checkmate. The squeeze was over. The prey was now in the trap, its heart still beating, unaware that its throat was already under the hunter's boot. For 24 hours, the Ashworths lived in a state of bewildered relief. A mysterious, deep-pocketed investor had swooped in and saved them from ruin, buying up their newly issued stock in a single, decisive move. The company was stabilized, the immediate threat of insolvency gone. In the boardroom, Richard Ashworth, a master of spinning disaster into victory, was already rewriting history. He paced before his shaken board members, framing the anonymous buyer not as a threat, but as a validation. "This entity, whoever they are," he declared, his voice regaining its familiar, booming confidence, "is a savvy, strategic partner. They recognize the deep, underlying value of this company. They know that our current troubles are a momentary blip. This is not a defeat, gentlemen. This is a vote of confidence." Julian nodded along enthusiastically, his face glowing with a desperate, second-hand bravado. They felt they had dodged a cannonball, never suspecting that the cannonball had been a distraction, and the hunter was now inside the castle walls. Their delusion was short-lived. The next morning, a formal, non-negotiable summons arrived. The new majority shareholder, via the law firm of Reed and Associates, was exercising its right to call an emergency meeting of the board of directors. The agenda was stark and brief: to discuss and vote upon the future leadership and strategic direction of Ashworth Industries. The tone was not one of partnership, it was one of absolute command. The meeting was set for the following day at 10 a.m. sharp. The blood drained from Richard's face. This was not the behavior of a friendly investor. This was the prelude to an execution. The air in the boardroom the next morning was thick enough to choke on. The board members, men who had owed their careers to Richard, sat in grim silence, shifting uncomfortably in their expensive leather chairs. Richard and Julian stood at the head of the long, polished mahogany table, the very same table where Elias had been judged and dismissed. They were trying to project an aura of control, but the facade was cracking. Their faces were pale, their posture rigid. They were kings in their own throne room, waiting for the conqueror to arrive and demand their crowns. The clock on the wall ticked with agonizing slowness, each second a hammer blow against the silence. At precisely 10 a.m., the heavy boardroom doors swung inward. First to enter was Evelyn Reed. Her presence alone, severe and commanding in a dark gray suit, sent a ripple of fear through the room. The board members knew of her by reputation. She was a cleaner, a killer, the lawyer you hired when you wanted to burn your enemy's empire to the ground and salt the earth. But it was the man who followed her in that stopped every heart in the room. He was tall and calm, moving with an easy, confident grace. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a simple dark tie. His hair was neatly cut. His face was clean-shaven. The only hint of his former life was in his eyes, which held a deep, steady quietness, the unnerving calm of a man who had stared into the heart of a storm and had not flinched. It was Elias Vance. A collective gasp went through the room. Julian's jaw fell open, a strangled, incredulous sound escaping his lips. Richard Ashworth staggered back a half step, his hand flying to his chest as if he'd been physically struck. His face, already pale, turned the color of ash. His mind, a finely tuned machine for calculation and strategy, simply shut down. It was impossible. It was inconceivable. The farm boy, the simple man, the dirt-stained nuisance was here, in his boardroom, looking as if he owned the very air they were breathing. "Good morning, gentlemen," Evelyn Reed said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. She placed a leather portfolio on the table and began distributing documents. "My name is Evelyn Reed. I am the legal counsel for Terra Vance Holdings, the new majority shareholder of this corporation. As of yesterday's market close, my client controls 51.4% of the voting stock." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Then she gestured toward the calm figure beside her. "Allow me to introduce you to the founder and sole proprietor of Terra Vance Holdings, Mr. Elias Vance." The last vestiges of Richard's composure crumbled. "This is a joke," he stammered, his voice a hoarse whisper. "A trick." Elias finally moved, walking slowly around the table until he stood directly opposite his father-in-law. He did not look angry. He did not look triumphant. He looked implacid. It was this unnerving calm that finally broke them. "It's no trick, Richard," Elias said, his voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the room. "You taught me a valuable lesson. You taught me that in your world, everything has a price. You wanted to buy my home, my history, my grandfather's memory. You put a price on it, so I decided to find out the price of yours." He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out the old repaired photograph of his grandparents. He gently placed it face up on the polished table, the image of the two smiling, honest faces, a stark contrast to the greed and fear in the room. "My heritage wasn't for sale," he continued, his eyes locked on Richard's. "But it turns out yours was. And it was surprisingly affordable." He then turned to the rest of the board. "For years, you have sat in this room and supported a man who believes that integrity is a weakness and that respect is something to be bought, not earned. You watched him try to swindle a man's legacy from him for profit. Your service to this company is no longer required." He gave a slight nod to Evelyn Reed. "Miss Reed, the first order of business." Evelyn, with the cold precision of a surgeon, read from the document in her hand. By the authority vested in it as the majority shareholder, Tara Vance Holdings tables a motion to remove all current members of the board of directors, effective immediately. She looked around the table. As we hold the majority, the motion passes. In a single sentence, their careers were extinguished. She then turned to a second document. Furthermore, we move to terminate the employment of Richard Ashworth as Chief Executive Officer and Julian Ashworth as Executive Vice President, for cause, effective immediately. She looked up, her gaze falling on the two ashen-faced men. "Security will escort you from the building. Your personal effects will be forwarded to you." It was over. So swift, so total, so absolute. Richard and Julian stood frozen, two statues of ruined pride. They were no longer titans of industry. They were just two unemployed men in expensive suits. As security guards entered the room, Elias spoke one last time, his voice still quiet, but now laced with the cold finality of a judge passing sentence. "You were right about one thing, Richard," he said. "I am a man of the earth, and the earth always, always settles its debts." He then walked to the head of the table and took the seat that Richard had occupied for 30 years. He sat there, silent and still, as the two men who had scorned and humiliated him were quietly led out of the room like common criminals, stripped of their power, their dignity, and their future. The boardroom coup was complete. The silence in Richard Ashworth's office was a heavy, suffocating thing. It was a room built on a foundation of power, decorated with the spoils of 1,000 victories. Abstract art worth more than a house. A desk carved from a single piece of rare wood, to a window that looked down on the city, as if it were a personal kingdom. Elias Vance stood before that window, but he did not see a kingdom. He saw a maze of concrete and glass, a world so far from his own that it felt like a foreign planet. The thrill of victory, the hot rush of adrenaline from the boardroom, had already faded, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache. He had won. He had conquered their world, and he had never felt more alone. He turned from the window and sat down in Richard's chair. It was cold and impersonal, a throne that offered no comfort. He picked up the phone and made a call to the head of security, his voice calm and steady. "Please find Mr. Richard Ashworth and Mr. Julian Ashworth. Escort them to this office. Do not be rough with them, but do not take no for an answer." He paused, then added, "Then, please find my wife, Clara Vance. Tell her I need to see her here immediately." He used her full name, a formal severing that began even before she arrived. Richard and Julian were brought in first. Their defiance had evaporated, replaced by a sullen, simmering rage and a palpable fear. They looked like caged animals, stripped of their territory and their teeth. "What is this, Vance?" Richard snarled, attempting to muster some of his old authority. "If you think you can," Elias held up a hand, a simple gesture that silenced him instantly. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Sit down," he said. It was a quiet command, but it held the absolute weight of his new power. Saturday, Elias slid a thin file across the vast, polished desk. It was Frank's final report. "I believe you'll find this interesting reading," Elias said. It's a detailed account of a series of meetings between officials in the Federal Highway Administration and a certain real estate developer. It outlines a conspiracy to use classified information to acquire land titles along a proposed route before that route was made public. It is a very clear-cut case of insider trading, wire fraud, and conspiracy. It carries a minimum sentence of 20 years in federal prison. The color drained from Richard's and Julian's faces. This was no longer about a corporate takeover. This was about their freedom. Their last vestiges of pride crumbled, replaced by a raw, naked terror. "You wouldn't," Julian whispered, his voice trembling. "You couldn't." Elias leaned back in the chair, his expression unreadable. "I could," he said simply, "but I won't. I have no interest in seeing you in prison. My interest was never in destroying you, but in stopping you from destroying anyone else. My lawyers will be in touch with yours. You will sign over your remaining personal assets to a trust that will compensate the other families you cheated along that highway route. And then you will disappear. You will resign from every board, every club. You will fade away. If I ever hear the Ashworth name connected with any kind of business deal ever again, this file goes to the SEC. Do you understand? They could only nod, their minds reeling, their entire world reduced to a single, damning file on a desk. It was at that moment that the office door opened and Clara walked in. She stopped short, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. Her husband, the man she had dismissed as a simple farmer, sitting in her father's chair, in absolute command. Her father and brother, the titans of her world, sitting opposite him, looking broken and utterly defeated. She had clearly heard the news of the takeover, but seeing it, feeling the complete reversal of power in the air, was something else entirely. "Eli," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Elias looked at her, and for a fleeting moment, he saw the woman he had once loved, the girl who had laughed in the sunset on the ridge. Then the moment passed, and he saw only the stranger she had become. Richard, Julian. "You can go now," he said, his voice flat. He dismissed them as one would dismiss servants. They scrambled to their feet and practically fled the room, leaving Elias and Clara alone in the cavernous office. She took a hesitant step forward. "Eli, I don't understand. Don't you, Clara?" he asked, his voice soft, but the softness was more cutting than any shout. "I think you understand perfectly. I was in the library at the gala." The door to the study was open. He saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes, the dawning horror as she realized what he meant. "I heard you," he went on, his voice still quiet, a clinical recitation of facts. "I heard you call my home a pathetic patch of dirt. I heard you tell your father you would break me. I heard you talk about the highway prospectus. I heard everything." Clara began to tremble, tears welling in her eyes. "Eli, I'm so sorry. I never meant. It was my father, he pressured me. I was weak." He listened to her excuses, the same ones she had probably been telling herself for years, and he felt nothing. The part of his heart that she had occupied was now a cold, empty space. "It doesn't matter anymore," he said, interrupting her. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a set of documents, sliding them across the desk to where the file had been. It was a divorce decree, already signed by him. "I'm not a vindictive man, Clara," he said, standing up and walking toward the window, turning his back to her. "The prenuptial agreement you had me sign is ironclad. Everything that is yours remains yours. Your trust fund, your apartments, your jewelry. I won't touch any of it." He paused, looking down at the city. "But I am not giving you a single dollar of what is now mine. Not my money, not my company, and not my name. You once told me you wanted more than a life on a farm. You wanted freedom from my world. Now you have it. You're free." He heard a quiet sob behind him. He did not turn around. This was not an act of cruelty, but one of finality. He was not punishing her. He was simply ratifying the choice she had already made. He was leaving her with the exact life she had chosen, with the family she had valued above all else, only now that family and that life were nothing but a pile of ashes. Without another word, he walked out of the office, leaving her standing alone with the divorce papers and the ruins of her family's legacy. He stepped into the elevator, and as the doors slid shut, sealing him off from the world he had just conquered, he did not feel like a victor. He felt only the profound, cleansing relief of a man who had finally, after a long and painful journey, found his way back home. The reckoning was over. 6 months passed. The name Ashworth Industries was scoured from the city's architecture, replaced by the quiet, solid name of Vance Legacy. Elias, the man they had dismissed as a simple farmer, proved to be an unnervingly adept leader. He ran the company with the same principles he ran his farm, with patience, a deep respect for the fundamentals, and an intolerance for waste and corruption. He dismantled the vanity projects, paid down the reckless debts, and treated his employees with a dignity they had never known under Richard Ashworth. He was respected, even feared, but he remained an enigma, a quiet man in a loud world, his motivations a mystery to all. The victory had given him power, but it had not brought him peace. The ghost of his past life, of the woman he had loved, and the man he had been, still lingered in the quiet hours of the night. The final piece of the puzzle, the true ending to his story, came not from a boardroom or a bank, but from a dusty, forgotten warehouse on the industrial outskirts of the city. While liquidating the last of the Ashworth's worthless subsidiary companies, his team came across a storage locker full of old, discarded files. Among the boxes of tax records and defunct contracts was a single, sealed, wooden trunk. Scrawled on its side was the name of a land surveying company that had gone out of business in the 1972nd, but underneath it, in faded lettering, was a single word, Vance. Inside, beneath rotting survey maps, was a small, locked metal box. Elias took it back to his office, the new one that had once been Richard's, and pried it open. It was filled with the journals of his grandfather. They were the journals he knew from his childhood, leather-bound and filled with his grandfather's elegant, sloping script, detailing crop rotations, weather patterns, and the simple joys and sorrows of a life tied to the land. But then he found a section in the final journal, its pages bound together with a thin, brittle piece of twine. He untied it and found a different kind of story. The handwriting was tighter, more urgent. It was the writing of a man confiding his deepest secret to the page. His grandfather wrote of the strange, dark seepage he had found while trying to dig a new irrigation channel after a bad drought 50 years earlier. He wrote of his own secret investigation, of taking a sample to the state university, and of the staggering results that had come back. He had known. All those years, he had known he was living on a fortune that could rival the gods. But what followed was not a plan for wealth, but a profound testament of fear. "The earth offered me a king's ransom today," his grandfather wrote. "But I fear it is a devil's bargain. A man can be rich in money and poor in spirit. I have seen what sudden wealth does to good men. It is a poison. It would burn through our family like a fever, turning brother against brother and making us forget that our true gold is in the topsoil, not a mile beneath it." Elias felt a shiver run through him. He was reading the exact moral crossroads he himself had faced. He turned the final page, where a single entry was written, dated just a year before his grandfather's death, as if it were a final will and testament addressed only to him. "If my grandson is reading this," the old man had written, "it means a time of great trouble has come upon our family, and the land has finally been forced to reveal its secret. I pray he is wise enough to see this power not as a sword for revenge, but as a shield to protect what is true. I pray he remembers that the best legacy is not what you own, but what you nurture. The blood of the earth is a dangerous power, my boy. Use it to heal, not to wound." In the sterile silence of his CEO's office, Elias Vance finally understood. His entire epic journey of vengeance, his meticulous planning, his cold, calculated victory, it had all been a test. He had faced the same temptation as his grandfather, and he had chosen the sword instead of the shield. He had vanquished his enemies, yes, but he had come dangerously close to becoming the very thing his grandfather had feared, a man so consumed by the wounds of the past that he was willing to poison the future. The victory in the boardroom felt hollow now, a clever trick compared to the simple, profound wisdom of the man who had raised him. Justice, he realized, was not about balancing the scales by piling up the ruin of your enemies. It was about planting a better garden for those who came after. The next day, Elias called a meeting with Evelyn Reed and his new board of directors. He announced the creation of the Vance Legacy Foundation. The vast majority of the profits from the oil, the blood of the earth, would be dedicated to a single mission: healing the land and the families who worked it. The foundation would provide grants to family farms on the brink of foreclosure, fund cutting-edge research in sustainable agriculture, and create legal defense funds to protect rural communities from predatory corporations just like the old Ashworth Industries. He was turning the weapon that had fueled his war into a tool to ensure no one else would have to fight it. The story ends not in the city, but back on the farm. It is late autumn, the air crisp and clean. Elias is not wearing a suit, but his old, comfortable work clothes. He walks to the ridge overlooking the valley, the same place where he once dreamed with Clara, the same place he made his silent vow. He kneels down, not as a king surveying his domain, but as a caretaker returning to his charge. He scoops up a handful of the dark, rich soil and lets it run through his fingers, the familiar texture, a comfort and a promise. He found a fortune beneath the earth, but he had rediscovered his soul within it. So remember this. Don't ever underestimate the silence of a person who has endured too much. For in that silence, they are not just plotting their survival. They are listening to the deep, secret wisdom of the world, learning that the truest power is not the kind that demolishes, but the kind that endures. And the greatest justice is not in the vengeance you reap, but in the seeds of a better world you sow for tomorrow. Thank you for listening. Join us again next time for another story from the heart of the family.